Haiphong. Thank you for coming to the unofficial, but sort of official book talk about my recently released book back in April by Skyhorse Publishing, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, The People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. We have great and esteemed speakers, comrades of mine and friends, Glen, Margaret, Kimberly, and Kovalik, who have joined me to discuss lessons that we can learn from this book in the struggle for social justice, liberation, and revolution. That is really the purpose of this book, and I'll just begin talking a little bit about myself. I don't do it that often. But again, I'm Haiphong. I'm an activist and a journalist. I'm also a social worker by trade. But I've been writing weekly for Black Agenda Report, for whom this book is dedicated to, for about 5 years. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which many know as the land of MIT, Harvard, and smug coastal elitism. But I grew up in a working class family. I'm the son of a Vietnam War veteran and a Vietnamese mother whose experiences with trauma profoundly shaped my life. Historical trauma is a relatively new term, and it's not really used by most radicals or leftists. But historical trauma, whether from my mother experiencing the U.S. spraying Agent Orange over the agriculture and water of Vietnam, or over 4 generations of colonialism from 3 different foreign powers, it's not something that can be so easily dismissed. The effects of historical trauma are passed down, and their legacy become a force in the making of history. White supremacy, which is the theme of the book, is a catalyst of historical trauma. I learned what a gook and a chink were at an early age, and how the legacy of U.S. warfare marked half of my family as inferior to white America. My father, who was white, was a federal worker, and the shame that I experienced and felt from him trying to meet a standard of living no longer in reach still resonates with me, especially in the precarious circumstances that many young people in the United States are forced to live under in this current historical moment. Isaiah Thomas, a Hall of Fame basketball player, he once said that observation and experience are the greatest teachers. And I think that this statement really encapsulates how American exceptionalism and American innocence, the people's history of fake news from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror, came to be. If I didn't experience the many ills of white supremacy and class rule, it would have taken me a lot longer to observe the injustices of this system if that moment would have ever come at all. So my experiences eventually led me to Black Agenda Report. I began reading at about 2011 during the height of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I was actually here in Occupy's birthplace, interning at a labor union after a hard year of engagement in anti-racist struggle around the arrest of a Dominican student and a friend at my college who had been charged with a hate crime for getting into a fight with a white man. The questions of race and class were swirling in my head, and I was desperately seeking answers. Black Agenda Report editors Glen, Margaret, Kimberly, and now, unfortunately, the late Bruce Dixon, were not afraid to channel the struggle of black freedom in their critiques of the Obama administration. Obama came into office as the great revitalizer of American exceptionalism. His presidency neutralized much of the left, even as he dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs around the world, invaded and destroyed the African country of Libya, privatized public education, and bailed out Wall Street, to name just a few of his signature policies. Black Agenda Report was a breath of fresh air for me during a period of political madness, which I feel is very much ongoing. I am very proud to say that Black Agenda Report was recently recognized with the Serena Shim Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism. There is no better descriptor of Black Agenda Report than uncompromised integrity, and without it, this book would not have been written. Roberta Servant, who co-authored this book with me, reached out to me in the summer of 2017 with the idea of writing a book that centers American exceptionalism in our analysis. However, we were thinking about this concept of fake news, but it wasn't a fake news that was defined by the ongoing, recently ceased Mueller investigation or the corporate media. We didn't really want to look at fake news from Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton's perspective either. We wanted to start from the premise that American exceptionalism and American innocence were fake news themselves. American exceptionalism presumes the U.S. as the most advanced and most democratic society ever formed, a force for good in the world ordained by God to bring civilization to savage natives, subhuman Africans, and the backwards people of the global South. American innocence, on the other hand, assigns benevolent intentions to the imperial and genocidal actions of the U.S. and the most impure motives to its supposed enemies. The presumption of innocence is usually a response to critiques of American exceptionalism and was on full display when, during a 60 Minutes interview in 1996, former Clinton Secretary of State Madeleine Albright remarked that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children by way of U.S. sanctions was quote-unquote worth it. We argue that American exceptionalism and innocence are embedded in every institution in the United States, from its media to its state apparatus, and that these ideologies justify the crimes of U.S. capitalism, white supremacy, and empire by creating a cross-class allegiance, indeed an alliance to these systems. So let's discuss this book. I'm going to talk about 4 points actually 3 points that I want to highlight. And I'm going to mostly talk from direct analysis with some passages from the book. So the first point is American exceptionalism really relies on this narrative of the American dream and American prosperity. And at the core of these myths is the profit motive. The U.S. is a capitalist society where rugged individualism is celebrated and the so-called free market rarely ever questioned. The pervasiveness of American exceptionalism and innocence is a large reason why. Its purveyors in the corporate media in Washington tell us that dictators in nations such as Syria are brutalizing their own people, but rarely mention the brutality that capitalism levels upon workers and poor people right here in the USA. Instead, we are fed a narrative that the U.S. is the most prosperous economy in human history. Here, workers can lift themselves up by their bootstraps and achieve the American dream, which is a euphemism for getting rich by working hard. Yet most Americans find themselves working harder and getting poorer. Black America, for example, according to the Economic Policy Institute, is in many ways in worse economic condition than in 1968. Black America possesses a higher unemployment rate than in 1968 and is dangerously close to possessing zero wealth by 2050 if current trends persist. This sounds more like what Malcolm X called an American nightmare rather than an American dream. The myth of the American dream, which is regurgitated ad nauseum by corporate sporting leagues such as the NBA and figures such as Ellen and Oprah, make us feel that prosperity is in reach when in fact we are being fleeced by an entrenched oligarchy. This oligarchy became fat from slavery and indigenous genocide, then took its system global to become the most formidable empire on the planet. After World War II, the U.S. comprised of over half of the world's gross domestic product. This is when the myth of the American dream reached its peak popularity. Some economists have called this age the golden age of capitalism. Indeed, living standards for millions of people improved as a result of the massive expansion of the war industry and redistributive policies that were largely fought for and won by the efforts of labor. But what did the narrative of American exceptionalism and the American dream leave out? It left out millions of people who were killed as a result of U.S. military spending during World War II. This includes the U.S. firebombing of Dresden alongside the United Kingdom. In just one day, the U.S. and the U.K. killed up to 30,000 civilians in a city that was seen as insignificant to the greater war effort, and mostly about intimidating the Soviet Union. It also excludes the Black Americans who remain subjected to the terrorism of Jim Crow. The myth of the Golden Age negates completely the reality that thousands of workers went on strike and forced the U.S. capitalist class to concede the right to form a union and the right to Social Security, among other policies that improved living conditions in the post-war period. The Golden Age of American capitalism was always fleeting. During the Golden Age, anti-communism was encouraged and socialists were suppressed by McCarthyism and the FBI's COINTELPRO operations. This allowed the ideology of American exceptionalism to flourish in the labor movement, and the struggle for social justice was divided and unprepared for the assault that was to come in the mid-1970s. Wages have been stagnant since this period, And currently just 3 individuals, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, own more wealth than the bottom half of the U.S. population. 4 to 5 people in the U.S. live paycheck to paycheck, and nearly half can't afford a $500 emergency. Thousands die in the U.S. each year from the lack of health care, and hundreds of thousands sleep outside or in a shelter on any given night. One must really be asleep to believe in the American dream. The second point that we really stress in this book is white supremacy. And white supremacy and American exceptionalism are the 2 peas in a pod. American exceptionalism cloaks the crimes of the U.S. imperial state under the banner of whiteness. When this banner is challenged, the rulers of the system cry innocence. Our book doesn't seek to justify or challenge the white supremacy of Donald Trump or the political right, as vile as it is. More concerning is the ways in which American exceptionalism has been propped up by the so-called liberal opposition to President Trump. We've seen this in the ongoing Colin Kaepernick situation, which we also highlight throughout the book. The NFL quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, was banned from the NFL for standing up to the racist military state as personified in its national anthem. Trump's comment that Kaepernick was a son of a bee and should be fired elicited an equally problematic response by those who see Trump as an embarrassment to American exceptionalist ethos. NFL owners and the corporate media demanded that the nation come together to fight Trump while ignoring the substance of Kaepernick's protest or the fact that he remains blacklisted from the NFL. American exceptionalism then not only manifests as the fiery patriotism and chauvinistic politics of people like Ray Moore, but also the supposedly well-intentioned reform efforts spearheaded by wealthy, self-identified liberals in the Democratic Party. The ideology reminds us that white supremacy isn't bigotry alone. It is a system of power that relies on mythologies to oppress, exploit, and destroy its targets. So American exceptionalism really equals white supremacy. The United States is the largest apartheid state in the world and the longest standing. It is a monument to white supremacy whose formation depended upon the corpses of enslaved Africans and indigenous people. The afterlives of slavery live on in the mass incarceration regime, which warehouses 2 million people, 40% of whom are black men, or the quote-unquote mud people that Wells Fargo financiers referenced when they were preying on the black community leading up to the 2007-2008 crisis. Hundreds of black Americans are killed by the police each year, and black unemployment is twice that of whites. An ideology that presumes the United States is a force for good in the world, which American exceptionalism does, must also believe that white supremacy is a force for good in the world. The third point that I want to really stress about the book is inclusion and diversity. This is a very pervasive political strand in the left at this time, and we believe it's one of the most insidious forms of American exceptionalism in this era. We have 2 chapters dedicated to this question of inclusion or diversity. Saving American Exceptionalism, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Inclusion, and the Violence of Inclusion, where we argue that the focus on diversity is a response to the revolutionary movements of the 60s and 70s. These neoliberal narratives tell us that the U.S. has come a long way by drawing a straight line from the struggles of black Americans for self-determination to the rise of leaders such as Barack Obama. The same goes for the struggle for women's rights and the rise of people like Hillary Clinton. Obama, Clinton, and the so-called inclusive members of the ruling class operate as valuable weapons of counterinsurgency warfare against radical and revolutionary social transformation. Their unquestionable loyalty to Wall Street and their war machine has made this explicitly clear. Inclusion and diversity are meant to comfort us and show us that a more reformed, indeed a more civilized-looking society exists. One can find diversity initiatives in every university, or at least most universities and colleges in this country. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, recently praised right-wing Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh for hiring an all-women's clerk team. In 2016, Hillary Clinton demanded it was her turn to be the first woman commander-in-chief. The corporate media has praised the likes of Boeing and Lockheed Martin for being run by mainly women executives. And during the annual Pride celebration this year, the NSA tweeted an image of its headquarters in rainbow colors. We argue that diversity and inclusion promote a dangerous form of careerism and loyalty to the dictates of American exceptionalism, American innocence, and the imperialist nightmare that these ideologies protect. While the political right has no interest in including Black Americans or anyone else deemed inferior within its ranks, the Democratic Party has become the engine of diversity. Democratic Party elites tell us that diversity is what the U.S. is all about, and that the careers of individuals like Clinton, Obama, and others like Kamala Harris demonstrate that the U.S. is an indispensable nation. In the book, we criticize the politics of inclusion, but avoid repeating right-wing talking points about identity politics, which are driven mainly by racial animus. We don't take part either in the debate about the virtue of representation or diversity in the abstract. Rather, we call attention to the very real impact that the politics of inclusion have had in rendering the U.S. empire a more effective evil, not a kinder one. Let's take Barack Obama. Black Agenda Report, we love talking about Barack Obama because he's been so important and so damaging to the movement. For 8 years, Barack Obama was heralded as a living example of Dr. King's dream and the struggles of Black Americans for equality. And for 8 years, no matter how far Obama and his administration flanked to the right, the Democratic Party machinery told progressives and leftists that he was the change that we all deserve. So as we say in our chapter on inclusion, in chapter 17, we say, quote, Obama's 2 terms in office did indeed bring about change, but it was the type of change that benefited U.S. imperialism at the expense of oppressed and exploited people. Obama chanted, "Si se puede, yes we can," during his campaign, and then deported 2.7 million undocumented immigrants. His solution to the 2007 and 2008 economic crisis was not to punish the finance capitalists responsible as promised during the campaign, but to feed them trillions of dollars worth of public bailout money that only enhanced wealth and income inequality. Under his administration, Obama would massively expand the war on terror surveillance apparatus to the extent that the National Security Agency possessed the phone, email, and online communications of every American citizen. He also prosecuted a record number of whistleblowers under the Espionage Act of 1917, including Chelsea Manning. By 2014, the Obama administration had transferred $750 million of military weaponry to police departments. And this increase, that was 24-fold from the Bush administration, was heavily criticized after it was found out by the Black Lives Matter movement, revealed by them, that Black Americans were being murdered by the police at a near daily rate. Obama's foreign policy was equally destructive. Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, only to tell his aides in 2012 that he was, quote, good at killing people, end quote. He wasn't lying. In contrast to just 52 drone strikes under the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration conducted several hundred drone strikes and murdered over 4,000 people, including several American citizens, in countries such as Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, and Afghanistan. His method of signature strikes chose targets based on suspicious behavior. To the administration, this was defined as all military-aged men in the aforementioned countries. Covert warfare, such as special operations forces trained in strike and kill missions, expanded greatly under Obama to the point where they were deployed in over 70% of the world's countries. American Special Operations Forces carried out 674 operations in Africa in 2014 alone. So our book is dedicated, dedicated 2 chapters on this topic because we feel it's both deceptive and seductive, the politics of inclusion. What is both dangerous and ironic is that innocence and exceptionalism, as manifested by inclusion politics, are often used to dehumanize and eliminate oppressed people. It is a politics of respectability that must be discussed further in our political organizations, activist circles, and in our communities. We must ask who and what do these politics serve. We say that they serve the war machine and the rich. So just to conclude, our primary goal is for readers of this book to understand that American exceptionalism and American innocence make it difficult for us to see that the U.S. is controlled by a ruling class that is ruthlessly exploiting workers and oppressed people for their own gain. We do this by, 1, highlighting the historic struggle of Black people and other exploited sections of U.S. society for total liberation from white supremacy, capitalism, and imperialism. 2, by analyzing popular culture such as sports, Oprah, and the popular musical Hamilton as monuments to white supremacy, empire, and capitalist dogma. And 3, not only accounting for the distance between the realities of working people and poor people to the myths of American exceptionalism, but also urging readers to develop an anti-war and anti-imperialist movement that is committed to solidarity with working people and poor people abroad through the participation in an ideological struggle. Thank you. So I don't have a bio for my fellow speakers, but they can introduce themselves. I will say that Kovalik is up next, and he will talk about the many things he speaks about, especially imperialism in Venezuela.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is for me to be speaking with the Black Agenda Report. I've been a huge follower and fan of you for a long time, and I do think you probably have more in journalistic integrity of any group I've ever known. So thank you very much. And I am also very proud to be speaking about Dan Haiphong's book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, which is a great book, and Danny, in general, is just a terrific journalist and a writer, both informative and entertaining, which is important. And with that said, I think American exceptionalism is a quite entertaining subject, and I want to kind of get into really, the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to get into the wittiness of it, because if it weren't so sad, it's actually quite funny. And Harold Pinter, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I quote him often, in 2005, in winning the Nobel Prize, he talked a lot about American exceptionalism, and he talked about how witty a trick it is when you think of it. And one website that's really gotten into the wittiness of American exceptionalism lately is The Onion, which I urge people to take a look at, which is really enjoying satirizing American exceptionalism. And so here's one example that I think goes along really well with Danny's book. This is a title from The Onion recently. Bolton argues war with Iran, only way to avenge Americans killed in upcoming war with Iran. Now, this is hilarious. It is, and it's silly, and yet it really encapsulates part of what Danny's talking about in the book about American innocence and about America as the victim, no matter what situation. I'll give you a good example where this logic that The Onion discerns was used. And I was just amazed, and maybe some of you in the room remember this. So, in the early days of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there were these two Defense Department spokespeople, a guy and a blonde woman who would go on TV every day and explain to the American people what was happening with the advance, the heroic advance of the Americans into Iraq. And at least on one occasion, they said, look, we have to tell you what happened today. American vehicles and tanks, we rolled in to Iraq, and we were met by a pregnant woman who stopped the vehicles only as a pretense to throw a bomb or a hand grenade at one of the tanks. And I'm not kidding when I say that they said, this proves why we needed to invade Iraq, because this is the type of people they are. They send pregnant women to attack our vehicles. They literally said this. This is John Bolton's reasoning. We had to invade Iraq because of the way they would defend us when we invade. And similarly, the statement was made about Venezuela. I believe it was John Bolton or Mike Pompeo, I don't remember which, but they said, trust me, if we invade Venezuela, they will kill American soldiers. And so this is part of this, again, incredible ideology, which again, on its face, when you look at it, it is amusing and crazy, and yet is believed. Even if people don't know what the words American exceptionalism mean, inside, they carry this with them every day. Actually, one of the things Danny said, it made me think of another quote. Actually, one of the best quotes about American exceptionalism I've heard recently was a couple of years ago. This is the quote, and I'll tell you who said it. He said that we judge ourselves by the best of our intentions, and we judge others by the worst of their conduct. And think about that. It's absolutely true, right? If we kill 2 to 4 million people in Vietnam, it's kind of an oops. Yeah, sorry, we meant well. Right? And over, that is kind of the position. We meant well, we're well-intentioned, we're nice guys. Yeah, we do horrible things once in a while, but we're nice guys. If other countries do bad things, whether they're real bad things or imagined or made up, it defines who they are. They're bad, right? This was a quote by George W. Bush in 2016. Kind of amazing. A guy who used American exceptionalism quite well in his so-called war on terror, but who understood it maybe as well or better than anyone. I think the one interesting thing about American exceptionalism, as the book goes into, is that it is based on a number of things. It's based on untruths, but it's also based on an unwillingness to face who we are. In 1905, the Democratic National Platform had this in the platform. It said that a country cannot exist one half Republican, one half empire, which actually is a quite profound statement. And pretty important today when we're probably a quarter Republican, 75% empire, if it's even that good. However, at the moment, and for some time, the U.S. has refused to recognize itself as an empire. It's the only empire that has ever existed on this planet that hasn't admitted it's an empire. Most empires are proud of being empires, right? The British Empire, the empire never, it was the empire where the sun never set. The Romans were not ashamed of their empire. But we're not an empire. Meanwhile, the Romans had 33 international bases, military bases, when they had their empire. The British, at the height of their empire, had 36 international military bases. The U.S. has at least 800 international military bases, but we're not an empire. It's really one of the most incredible mind games ever played on our population, but on the world. Which also, and the other thing, this book that I like about American exceptionalism, it gets into also popular culture and Hollywood as promoters of American exceptionalism. In one movie, of course, that comes to mind when you talk about empire, Star Wars, right, where the empire is so important, right? The whole struggle is by the fledgling rebel group and the empire. And when I was growing up, and I assume, like a lot of kids my age, because I was probably 7 or 8 or something at the time I first started Star Wars, I identified with the rebels and thought that that was the U.S., right? Fighting against maybe the Soviet Empire or an imaginary empire, it didn't matter. But, in my view, we would never be the empire, we would got to be the rebels, right? Of course, as I later grew up, I realized how absurd that was, but my guess is that's how most Americans think. Meanwhile, those on the left, I learned later, those who had grown up in the 60s, thought immediately that the rebels had to be the Vietnamese fighting the United States, which actually makes a lot more sense, right? But that's how we've really turned the world upside down in this doctrine of American exceptionalism, where not only is the U.S. innocent, it's always the underdog. That's the other incredible thing. We have more nuclear weapons, we have the biggest military by far in the world, and yet somehow we're always the underdog, right? I once wrote a piece, you remember the hockey, 1980, the miracle team, when the U.S. beat the Soviet Union. How's it a miracle that the most powerful country in the world beat another country in a hockey team? The only miracle is that people believed it was a miracle. And again, there's probably people in the room that find that horribly offensive, but it's actually true, and it's, again, part of this American exceptionalism and this assumption of innocence. And the other kind of part of the innocence and the victimhood is also the no right of others to defend themselves against this. That's a very important part of all this, which of course gets to the John Bolton quote, for example. But like, you look at Vietnam, for example, and what was the casus belli of the big, major congressional authorization of the war in Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. First of all, it didn't happen. Okay, let's start with that premise. But what was said to have happened? That the Vietnamese attacked 2 U.S. naval ships in international waters while the U.S. was pounding Vietnam with napalm and Agent Orange and incendiary bombs, while the U.S. soldiers were murdering, raping women, children. And yet, somehow, the Vietnamese attacking U.S. naval ships was verboten. Vietnam never, remember all the Vietnamese in New York City who were fighting us? No, the Vietnamese never attacked us on our soil. And yet they couldn't even attack the U.S. Navy. And it's that view that other people just have to take it. And this goes back to George Washington, who as general made it clear that if Indians defended themselves, they were to be punished for defending themselves. They were to be mercilessly treated, including women and children. This goes back to the founding of our country. And that's why now with Iran, they shoot the U.S., again, incredible notions of entitlement the U.S. has. Again, a part of American exceptionalism. U.S. sends naval ships, troops, drones, etc. to the Persian Gulf, where the Iranians live, right? It's like going to someone's neighborhood and says, we want to fight you, starts shooting stuff into the air, including drones, and then when one is shot down, you're attacking us. How is that possible that we're the ones being attacked, that we're the victims? But again, it is that underpinning of American exceptionalism that is so important today. The last thing I want to close, how much time do I have left? Okay, perfect. One of the very important and the most spoiled children of American exceptionalism is humanitarian interventionism, another subject of the book, right? Which is now, I believe, a competing doctrine, which is maybe the most strong pro-war doctrine I've ever seen. And humanitarian interventionism, or R2P, or responsibility to protect, these are doctrines, again, very linked to and come from American exceptionalism. They are the ideas that the West and the U.S. in particular not only may, but must intervene around the world in defense of human rights. And it is such a powerful doctrine that people, including and especially liberals, tend to believe if the U.S. is not bombing somewhere, the U.S. is not upholding human rights principles. Again, that sounds outrageous, but let's take a recent example. After one of the alleged chemical attacks in Syria, this was shortly after Trump was elected, I want to say March, April of 2017. Trump responded by a bombing raid in Damascus near the airport. I believe that's what he did. In any case, he was applauded by the elite media, by the liberal media, by liberal pundits as acting presidential. Do you remember that? It's one of the few times they acknowledged that he was acting presidential. Why? Because, again, the U.S. must act militarily in order for human rights to be upheld. That is an assumption. When, of course, the real assumption people should have is that for human rights around the world to be protected, the U.S. must refrain from intervention and must stay home. One of the most fascinating and illustrative examples of this mind, there's an F word I can use, but mind manipulation was the run-up and the invasion of Libya. And why? So first of all, one of the intellectual authors, one of the people who pushed for that intervention was Samantha Power. Ms. Genocide herself, right? She became famous with a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called A Problem from Hell. It's a 1,000-page tome about genocide and how the West has screwed up, not by committing genocide. She never talks about any of those examples, because of course the U.S. never commits genocide, but they've screwed up by not doing enough around the world to stop genocide, right? So she became Obama's ambassador to the UN, and as ambassador to the UN, she pushed for the invasion of Libya to defend human rights and prevent genocide, okay? So NATO bombs Libya, as we know, for many months, does topple the regime of, or the government, we call it a regime of Muammar Gaddafi. And what is the result? Genocide. Not only did she not prevent genocide, she and Clinton and Susan Power helped create it. And how? Not just by siding with jihadists in Libya to overthrow the government, but by a lie that they made to justify that invasion. And the lie was that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries to fight his war in Libya. This was not true. In fact, the media was happy to repeat this lie, and they said, you know how you can tell the black mercenaries? From their uniforms. They wear yellow hard hats. Yeah, they were construction workers. But what did this do? Not only did it help lie us into a war that destroyed a nation now that has slaves being sold openly on the streets, but it marked black Libyans for genocide. Because they weren't people, they weren't workers, they were mercenaries. And so during and after the toppling of Gaddafi, the jihadists went after black people in Libya. They depopulated black towns. They arrested black people en masse. They summarily killed black people, and now they're enslaving black people. And so the mother of the anti-genocide movement, Samantha Power, actually became a genocidaire. And yet you'll rarely hear anyone say that. And I'm sure she sleeps well at night. If you look at her Twitter feed, and I do, her background picture is of her kids playing soccer back in Boston. But in any case, this is the height of hubris and hypocrisy that really, to me, illustrates this dangerous doctrine of American exceptionalism more than any other. And I will just end with this quote by Eduardo Galeano, who said, every time the U.S. saves a country, it converts it either into an insane asylum or a cemetery. And that is true. We know this to be true. That is why what we need to do is not be looking for the next place to intervene to protect human rights, but the next place to stop a war by the United States. Thank you. Okay, I just wanted to note, I have my new book up in for sale right here afterwards, if you're interested. Thank you. And Danny allowed me to do that. So, thank you very much.
So that was Kovalik, retired human rights lawyer now, right?
Labor lawyer. I'm still a advisor, but I retired from the union.
Okay, retired from the United States Workers Union.
That's right.
And now just a revolutionary, traveling revolutionary.
Right, exactly.
And a lot of what we talked about is actually in the book. And Libya is a huge subject in the book. And to add to what Dan said about Libya, those mercenaries were also accused by CNN and the corporate media for using Viagra distributed by Gaddafi to rape women and children. And so this need for the U.S. empire to use its imperial and white superiority and its always ingrained innocence to destroy other nations is critical to our understanding. One quick announcement before we get to our next speaker. This book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, is on sale at the Haymarket table. They were very generous to allow that, so if you're interested, please, I'll be around. Hopefully we'll have 30 to 45 minutes of speaking and questions after our speakers. So please stick around and I'll give you a copy of the book if you choose. So next is Executive Editor of Black Agenda Report, Glen Ford, and always an inspiration, so he will come and speak a few words. Thank you.
Proud to be here. Now, this book is really exceptional. It's a wide-ranging book and very creatively put together. But its wide-rangingness is really of necessity because exceptionalism is baked in to the American narrative and into the American popular consciousness, and saying that exceptionalism is baked in really is just another way of saying that lies are baked in. The U.S. mythology is a lie. It is a fallacy. And that's not an assessment of a narrative that was put together a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, and therefore only of historical relevance. The U.S. corporate media, their job is to, every day, create a narrative for what is going on in the world that makes the United States seem exceptional and a force for good, and alternatively, one that is under attack from every Lilliputian in the world all the time. They have to handle these contradicting narratives, but they do it. That's what being a journalist in the corporate media is today. How people who are skilled at handling contradictory narratives, neither one of which is true, and constant lies, and making them seem sensical. This is a difficult skill that they have mastered, but it has nothing at all to do with journalism. Now, I think it's important that this book really examine at so many levels the baked-into-ness of white supremacy in the American history. Because even people on the left, since it has been so baked in, don't recognize the primacy of white supremacy as part of, as the mission of these folks. Nearly enough. In the Declaration, brother was talking about U.S. empire today. Well, you know, these founding fathers, they thought of what they were doing. Even before they had defeated the British colonial army, they thought, and they verbalized it, that they were putting in motion an incipient empire. For them coming from a much smaller place, Europe, a small country, many of them had disembarked from Holland, little tiny places when you get to a U.S. scale. And here they were looking out across this continent saying, all of that should by right be ours. Meanwhile, there are more people living on that continent than their little colonies on the eastern fringe. But they believed that they had it by, they said divine right, but everything they did and also said by racial right, because these people were not human beings. So in their Declaration of Independence, their founding document before there actually is a government, they say, they blame the Brits, they explain why they want to separate from the Brits by saying that the British are exhorting these savages, meaning the Native Americans, against us, and they are encouraging the slaves to revolt. Well, so that is their justification for separating from the British, because the British would not allow them to continue their unlimited depredations against the native people with whom the British had agreements. And the British, the colonists thought, settlers thought, might be too amenable to the prospect of eventual emancipation. So they had to get out of there. So this place was founded on the maintenance of white supremacy and the expansion of white supremacy. And it's only in very, very recent years that they have found it necessary to cloak that whole history. We need to look at the United States as a white settler nation. And if we do, then everything that it in fact has done in history makes great sense. And that history of the development and expansion of a white settler nation goes directly to the present day. The United States' closest relationships with other nations in the world is with what's commonly called the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are the United States, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia. The United States shares almost all of its intelligence on a regular basis, that is, day to day, not upon request, you get it when I got it, with those five nations. And who are those nations? They are Britain, the mother country, or the motherfucking country, and its white settler country, its white settler states, colonies, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. So that, the nature of the genesis of the United States has produced relationships that are based upon similar genesis in the world. The United States had to go through a makeover of the stories that it told internally and the stories that it told externally, the lies, to others and to itself after World War II, as it becomes the superpower, the unchallenged superpower on the capitalist side of the ledger. But that is a period of decolonization. And the Soviet Union, and I don't want to hear people talking about Stalinism and all that stuff, the Soviet Union being a champion of decolonization in the world and having given material aid to liberation movements in the world, was the ideological competitor with the United States with these emerging nations. And so the U.S. had to radically change its clothing. I think one of the most dramatic crises that the United States faced as it tried to put on these new inclusive and racially progressive clothes that really didn't fit at all, was with the Little Rock crisis. That is when these young black kids were trying to integrate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, and these mobs of thousands of white people, most of them white women, turned out screaming, spitting, cursing, threatening to kill these little kids, half of them drunk. It was a real spectacle. The United States did not look well in that spectacle, and that was one of the first stories of modern television. This is before Birmingham, 1957 in Little Rock, and it was a profound embarrassment to the United States. And so we see President Eisenhower, who was a racist and segregationist himself. He had opposed the desegregation of the Army, so we know how he stood on that. Sent in the troops because he had to, in order to forcibly change the clothes of the United States. But we need to not look at this ever-changing picture, which it is the corporate media's job to collaborate in shaping and reshaping over and over again, but the actual history of the United States, and then we understand better the forces that we have to contend with while we struggle in the United States. We don't have the luxury of fighting against new and remade villains. We don't have the luxury of listening to people retell their story 10,000 different ways. We need to know what actually motivates Americans and what are the precursors of the institutions that we struggle against today. We have to understand that the United States was the world's first racially regimented society. And it was a big country. It wasn't like Liechtenstein deciding to racially regiment people. This was a huge and the most dynamic, because of slavery preceding this, the most economically dynamic country in the world. And they set about the project, this is during Jim Crow post-emancipation, of creating the first fully racially regimented society. And Hitler admired that, and he said so. That's what he wanted to do with his country, and this big, vibrant country had already done it. And of course, South Africa admired that. That's what they wanted to do in the country in which they were the minority. So the United States has not just been embarrassing in its racial peccadillos, it is the champion of white supremacy in the world. And in fact, if you understand that it is the champion of white supremacy in the world, and deserves all of those, that description, then you understand why we have the Boltons that our friend was describing. These are white supremacists to the bone. It's the product of a white supremacist worldview. And they say these things with a straight face because they are white supremacists to the bone. But they didn't come from a strange place. They came from the United States. That is what is baked into folks. And it does affect people who become, or even who have been lifelong leftists. You know, it's only been a matter of maybe 4 or 5 years or so that we on the left have been speaking as if everybody knew that U.S. chattel slavery was a distinct form of capitalism, one that had institutions that resemble financial instruments that are used today, that were in fact the generally used instruments to secure slave populations in the 1800s. But, you know, I remember that even people who called themselves Marxists, wanted to put slavery off to the side somewhere, that it had its own rules, and that labor relationships and the super exploitation and the speed ups on the plantations, but that didn't have much to do with free labor and the struggles of free labor. This can only be explained. That is, that American Marxists would go to such lengths to distort their own analyses, to somehow put slavery and therefore the racial question off to the side and call it some kind of other phenomenon, rather than being a very distinct capitalistic institution that in fact was the engine that catapulted the United States into the world power status that it gained. So deconstructing the lies is a constant job for anybody living in America, and trying not just to tell the truth, but to make sense out of this situation, because the lies have poisoned not only everyone's attitudes towards everyone else, making us all have to deconstruct our daily, what we did all day, to see if we if we let these prejudices sink in. But it infects all of our conversations and our strategizing. That is, we really, I believe, have to, as activists, examine our personal behavior and our institutional behavior methodically, as a matter of our work ethic, to see if we are operating on some of the universally spread in the United States lies that actually work against the projects that we're engaged in. This is a deep subject, and I think that the charm of the book, but also the utility of the book, is that it takes often a humorous approach. They're saying, you know, we're not just being fed lies, but we're living these lies. And when we live these lies, we affirm them and we make them true. That is, there are consequences to these lies, and trains of consequences, and you lose track of of the fact that it began with these lies that we also participate in transmitting. You know, the United States had that big problem in terms of its competition with the Soviet Union, which actually did aid colonized people and liberation movements, but then the Soviet Union dissolved and the United States became the strutting white supremacist bully that it always had been, but there were no breaks to its behavior. And that's when we see hyper-aggression becoming daily U.S. policy, and now accepted, as was explained, as the proper behavior for a superpower. Superpower must bomb, lest someone forget that that's what he does. And so, have we bombed lately? We do it, and people, that is, people in the United States, accept it. People around the world are appalled and shocked and terrified by it, and become determined to somehow, by hook or crook, get rid of this mad dog country. But it works in the United States, and it's now working among a segment of the black population of the United States, which used to, in my youth, and even when I wasn't young anymore, be generally immune to much of the white supremacist imperialist propaganda that comes out of all of the organs of the rulers of the United States. In not mixed company and black company. I remember we used to talk about who they bombing now, who they messing with now, what they doing. It was very clear, and this was the communist way of black folks speaking to each other. It was very clear that we did not identify with the actions and motivations and the purported interests of the United States. But it's been a long time since we've had a movement that actually articulated what black folks do believe in. And so that kind of skepticism of power, which was the mark of black politics, has been weakened. And now with Russiagate, we see the spectacle of Maxine Waters, who not too long ago was righteously accusing the CIA of bringing crack into her city of Los Angeles. And she, for a long period of time, waged that campaign against the CIA. Now she believes everything that the CIA says, everything the FBI says, and she's strutting around with an American flag to prove that she's now one of the converted. But she's recently converted. And this kind of behavior is rather recent in Black America. But it is cause for great alarm. It means that we have not had a movement for so long that those anti-imperialist, anti-white supremacist, anti-rule of the rich sentiments that were hallmarks of black politics, things you didn't even have to explain, they were just assumed. Those are not reliable anymore. And that's quite dangerous. If black folks are the most politically volatile and left-leaning constituency in the country, whose active participation has been absolutely necessary if there is to be broad-based movements for social transformation, if we are getting brainwashed and following behind Auntie Maxine Waters, then that's a movement that's a problem for anybody who wants to remake the movement. In other words, I think that we, although who went so long being somewhat immune to American exceptionalism and other idiocies and deliriums, are now more prone to infection. And that's bad news for all of us organizers out there. Power to the people.
Thank you, Glen. So last but not least will be Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist at Black Agenda Report.
Thank you, Danny. I just, before I begin my remarks, I just want to, some of you may not realize who the person is whose photo is on the podium, Bruce Dixon. Our managing editor at Black Agenda Report passed away yesterday. And we are, all of us, and just being here today, paying homage to him. Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you for dedicating the book to me. Danny dedicated the book to the Black Agenda Report today. And he didn't tell me, I didn't know until I opened the book. I was like, oh my God, that's my name. So thank you so much. It's a funny thing, Glen just made reference to the Five Eyes, the intelligence agencies spawned by British settler colonialism. And if the truth about Russiagate ever comes out, we will see the role of the Five Eyes in this story. And I'm deviating a little bit, but it's an opportunity to talk about it. There was foreign intelligence agency involvement in the 2016 election, but it was MI6. It was the Australians. I find it difficult to believe, and nobody should believe, that George Papadopoulos, who was a nobody in in Trump's campaign, a volunteer in London, and that the Australian ambassador would want to talk to him. No, he wouldn't. He was being spied on. But anyway, that's another story. Perhaps next year we'll come and I can talk about it then. But the subject of fake news. Fake news is all we get in the U.S. It's all we're told as we're growing up. Glen also mentioned the Declaration of Independence. I went to college, I was a history major, but I left college before I knew everything the Declaration of Independence said, and that they specifically mentioned indigenous people, specifically mentioned enslaved people in the Declaration of Independence. And why was I never taught that in 12 years of schooling in college? Because if you tell the truth, then people behave differently. If you tell the truth, then people know that they're getting lies. So it's fake news as we're growing up, fake news when we turn on the networks, fake news when we read the papers of record, the New York Times and the Washington Post, fake news on MSNBC and CNN. And we have a burden, unfortunately, to learn a lot on our own. And that's of course, why we come to places like the Left Forum. And it amazes me when I look back the number of lies I was told my entire life. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I had the notion that I was being lied to, something about the Russians, as, maybe they said the Soviets. But that this state was much weaker, despite, being this monster that was going to, attack us in our beds at night or something, that it had its own internal problems. And then it collapsed. And I remember saying to myself, you mean to tell me after all the, and I was an adult, of course, I'm a little embarrassed to admit it now, but how many lies, the depth and the repetition through the news, through education, through popular culture, that I had taken in. And so it's the organizing principle of the country. And we can see it today. No one, or very few people, question that the U.S. has a right to attack Iran, has a right to attack Venezuela, people who are allegedly respectable. Actually talking about the Monroe Doctrine, 200 years after the fact, people, they should be embarrassed, but they're not. It's our backyard, which, first of all, sounds so stupid. It sounds like someone, protecting their lawn or something, but it's our backyard, and which presumably means nobody else has a backyard. Does anybody else have a backyard? Russia didn't have a backyard in Ukraine, which was right next door. The whole world is America's backyard. Venezuela can be, or Iran, any country can be America's backyard. And they talk openly about when Trump called, there was going to be a strike and Trump changed his mind. Was Trump praised by media? No. They were saying, oh, sets a precedent, he could be questioned, he looks weak. Liberal media who are allegedly don't like him repeated all of these things. In Venezuela, the only issue is whether they were smart enough to have a coup, not whether the U.S. had a right to do it, not whether the U.S. has the right to impose sanctions on that country, which have killed 40,000 people, according to a recent study. With another fact, by the way, that the corporate media don't mention. Unless you move in our circles, you don't even know that this happened. But this exceptionalism does not just impact foreign policy. It impacts our daily lives. It impacts domestic policy. A couple of days ago, I saw on Twitter Newt Gingrich. I thought he was dead, but he's still around. And he's on Twitter. And he was tweeting about student loan debt and the question of whether or not loans should be forgiven. And he said, well, if leftists want to do this, they should give money to the people who already paid back their loans. It's not fair to them. And I paid my student loan. If I don't begrudge anybody, let everybody off the hook. That's what I say. But I thought about it, And he's not the only one who says this. I've heard people, allegedly intelligent, sensible people, say similar things. And I think this notion of America being exceptional, it means, well, people think it means that they live in this perfect society. Americans are incapable of imagining, even imagining something different. So if all your life you're told you have to pay back student loans and somebody comes along and says, maybe not. Instead of saying, oh, I never thought about that. Nope, can't be done, shouldn't be done, how are you going to pay for that? People are going to get away with something, all sorts of retrograde opinions. Because someone has mentioned something that is different. And so also, so it's this weird thing where people can't imagine anything different because we're so wonderful. So when people see something that they should oppose, for example, the asylum seekers at the border with Mexico, and children being separated from their parents, and children being kept in these horrible conditions, what people say it's bad, they say they want to stop it, that's good, but then they say, this is not who we are. Well, yes it is. It is who we are. This is a country which keeps more people in prison than any other country on the planet, where pregnant women are kept in prison and give birth in shackles, where for hundreds of years families were separated by the slavery system. So it is who we are. So even in denouncing a policy that people don't like, there's still this resistance, this very strong resistance to acknowledging the history of this country. It's too, I think, literally it's too painful for people, too much cognitive dissonance, if I may say. So we know that people, we as individuals, we're resistant to change. In our collective identities, we are resistant to change, especially if we feel we're being criticized. And so I try to be, I guess, somewhat empathetic when I think about my own growth. Most of my life I was a Democrat. Now all I do is talk about dumping the Democrats. But for most of my life I was. And before I became part of the Black Agenda Report team and availed myself of some self-education, I was, to a certain degree, part of that cohort. And so I know it's going to be a heavy lift to get people to change, but I also know that it can be done. And when there are crises, that's the moment. When Bush stole the election in 2000, my whole life I was told, well, it's kind of possible you could lose the popular vote, still be elected president, but it's not going to happen. It's, mathematically impossible. But there we were. The person who lost is the one who was sworn in as president. The election was stolen. The party that got stolen from was silent and went along. And I think we have to use these events, these eye-opening events, to strike and to organize and to educate ourselves in the struggle. Decolonizing is a hot term of the day, but it's a lifelong struggle. I just speak for myself. I realize there are things I say and think, and I have to say, hey, whoa. We can't say, and it can happen, we will use the first person when referring to our government. We, us, our. Should we attack Iran? Now, even if your answer to the question is no, why are you making it we? It's not you, it's the government, it's the president, it's the army. So the question is not should we attack Iran, or should we do this or that, or our national interest. They put all of this in it, our national interest in fill in the blank. We don't have any interest in these places where our government is doing some sort of dirty work. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to make sure we have time to talk. So thank you all very, very much for supporting us. And please buy Danny's book today. Thank you.
So we will move into the discussion portion of the panel, but before we do that, I just want to give a thank you to the other panelists who have taught me so much, and really without them, this book would not have been written, so give it up for them again. So before we get in, I just want to say a few closing remarks before we get into the discussion. What is beautiful about this panel to me is that, I chose Margaret, Glen, and Dan to speak with me because I knew that they would basically talk about what my book says and save me from having to figure out what should I really focus on. Dan talked about humanitarian intervention, which there's a chapter in the book about that. Glen talked a lot about the historic struggle of Black America for self-determination and its anti-war history. And we reference that many times throughout the book, and how in one chapter, Should Imperialism Matter to Black Lives Matter, that this retreat of that historical consensus is a huge reason why imperialism is really not on the table of discussion, even in movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement broadly. So we talk about the intricacies of that, the highlights, the ups and downs of the last 5 years or so of that nascent movement. And Margaret talked a lot about Russiagate, and we have a chapter in the book called If It's Bad, Blame Russia, where we really analyze the Cold War, the Soviet era of history, and how that has had a huge influence on the way that Russiagate is talked about and its influence in our movements. And we really want to highlight in the book that this Russophobia, this anti-Russian hysteria, is rooted in anti-communism, it's rooted in white supremacy. And it's rooted in the notion that Russians are evil, and that they are lurking under our beds, that they are stealing our elections, and stealing our freedoms, quote unquote. So, we talk about in the book how we really need to go towards an internationalist perspective. That's really the next step. We have 80% of people in the United States wanting a Green New Deal, 80%, or Democrats at least, 80% of Democrats who vote Democrat wanting Medicare for all. But not many people know that Paul Robeson, for example, his kids were raised in the Soviet Union and they were educated there. And so when we talk about American exceptionalism, we're talking about a process, an ideological process that's all about ensuring that we see people around the world, people struggling around the world, oppressed people as our enemies. And we have to really begin to study and understand the processes that are going on and really unlearn these myths that are teaching us that Russians are in fact out to get us, when in fact the U.S. was never a democracy at all. So with that said, I think what we're going to do is take maybe one question at a time. I'm not a moderator per se, so be patient and please try to keep the 2 minute comments. So in the front right here, you.
So thank you for a very good panel, excellent. I want to commend your publisher, Haiphong Books, for publishing this book. Not all their titles.
I don't mean to interrupt, but so Haymarket didn't publish the book. Skyhorse Publishing actually did. Haymarket is allowing it to be sold at their table. So just to clarify, if that at all has an influence on your comments.
Yeah, well, it segues into my comments because there are other trends within the left. And I particularly think of a book called, I think it's called Indefensible, I believe that is the Haymarket title. But it talks about what they call the red, brown alliance of basically left people supporting right movements. And it is a trend within the left. Thankfully not in this panel. But if you could speak to that trend and how your particular analysis differs from that particular analysis, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks. Does anyone want to answer that question? Okay, I'll answer it then, Margaret. So yes, my view on that trend is that it's complete horseshit. It makes me very angry, actually, because in this era of Russiagate, especially in the era of Trump, let's be honest, the left has taken a marked turn to the right. And that's not just because of Donald Trump. A lot of people you may talk to may think, oh, it's because of Trump's racism, it's because of Trump's bigotry and sexism and all of that. All those things are legitimate issues. However, what has really taken the left to the right is this wholehearted belief of what the corporate media and the U.S. intelligence apparatus has said about Russia and what they continue to do in relation to its conspiracy that Russia somehow was able to influence the elections to the point of electing Donald Trump. And so this whole red-brown alliance, I see it as an extension of anti-communism. There are still many Americans who, especially older Americans, but even younger leftists who continue to see Russia with the eyes of the Soviet Union. The understanding that Russia still represents this so-called totalitarian dictatorship. And really it's a racist leaning, and it's a problem that speaks to the ideological confusion in this country. Because with prominent leftists in left publications, I won't say their names here, but you may know who they are, to continue to equate not only today's Russia with the Soviet Union. Today's Russian government is more of the product of the United States than it is the product of the Soviet Union. The U.S. backed Boris Yeltsin in '96, destroyed it, and then he went on to dissolve Parliament, bomb Parliament actually, and use the military to bomb Parliament, and to create a one-president constitution, basically. And that's the government that the evil Putin resides in right now. However, this red-brown alliance question is so troubling because we have people calling governments like Syria products of national liberation movements against colonialism fascist. We have a leftist saying that Russia is fascist when, in fact, the Soviet Union lost tens of millions of people, 27 million, I think, during World War II, fighting off the Nazis. And actually, if you want to look at Putin's history, his family comes from that tradition. Regardless of what we may think of Putin himself as an individual, we have to understand that it seems pretty ludicrous to call Russia's current economy and its current state a fascist state. So that's all I'll say on that, and I'll let Margaret add on anything.
I have to say, I keep hearing about a red-brown alliance, but I don't know who is being discussed. I mean, who is this red-brown alliance? Can you name a group, a person? I think it's fictitious, just to be quite honest with you. I think leftists have differences of opinion, especially over Syria. But I don't know any leftists who are working with fascists. I don't know who is being discussed. So I think this is a trope, that's a hot word these days, that I just don't go along with. I don't know if you care to tell me if there is someone I'm missing, if you want, I don't want to disrupt the spot. But who is being referred to? I find that many of the people who use this term of a red-brown alliance are beating up on leftists who are anti-imperialists. That's been my experience with this term.
Now we see this kind of talk that labels everyone who opposes, for example, the EU in Europe, which is a rich man's mechanism for enforcing austerity and for whittling away at whatever social safety net had been built up over many years in Europe. This is an EU, you saw what they did to Greece and how they just strangled and pummeled and tortured the Greek people to show that nobody bucks the bankers' regime of the EU. How in the world are people who call themselves leftists and Marxists taking the side of that capitalist machinery, the EU? And this flows over into the discussion about Brexit. I have no doubt that there are sizable groups of folks who supported Brexit in Britain who resemble Trump's people in Louisiana. But that is no reason for leftists to then take a position against Brexit or pro-EU. Obviously, any leftist who takes that position has been walked down the American exceptionalist narrative path, and that's the furniture and the landmarks that he or she knows. But they're not thinking like independent left activists. They're dismounting what's the narrative. In terms of Russia, Russia is not my country. The greatest danger to the world is U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism threatens to destroy the world with nuclear weapons, as it constantly foments and instigates wars. This latest phase was put in motion by Barack Obama as part of this offensive that began in 2011 and then moved to Ukraine. And just a horrible, destabilizing period in history. It was Putin who, in 2015, went to that General Assembly meeting at the United Nations and defended the principle of the sovereignty of nations. U.S. exceptionalism says, no, we're exempted from that. Putin had to stand in that world forum and cite that basic elementary principle. Are we going to not praise that? Because it was an important speech. It set the U.S. back a little bit. We're not going to praise that because we have problems with the Russian government? That doesn't make sense. I don't understand that kind of analysis and prioritizing. And obviously, many of us are deeply, deeply infected with the American exceptionalist disease.
So I'll take the question of the woman in the back.
So this is sort of related to that last question. What do you see as the danger from groups like the ADL and the SPLC that claim to be fighting against hate and fighting against white supremacy, but actually defend for their existence on people being afraid of white supremacy and redefining these terms so that they silence genuine criticism, imperialism, criticisms of the left, etc.? How do we fight back against these groups, basically?
So, does anyone else want to take the question? I'll take it as well, but, and Glen. So, yeah, that was kind of the architect of this Red-Brown Alliance term. Those organizations, they've really fed into that. My take is that, and the reason why this book was made was to really counter and challenge, and counter and challenge this notion that the United States is always on a path toward becoming a more perfect union. That's a huge piece of American exceptionalism. And this idea of reformism that is so deeply embedded without a revolutionary movement, without a really massive movement on the ground in this country, American exceptionalism and those assumptions become dominant. And so when Russiagate happened, it was really American exceptionalism going off the deep end. And so a lot of organizations, and left-leaning organizations, liberals, the corporate media, there was a historical consensus between them around the predations of the intelligence apparatus. And so the intelligence apparatus really cares about demonizing and dismantling and neutralizing leftists. And what ended up happening was we became equated with the so-called political right that had made Trump ascendant. And the political right was then equated with Russia for making Trump ascendant. And so, in order to really fight that trend, it's really going to take an analysis of what Russiagate is, and we do that in the book, but also understanding who are the sources of this and what are our interests in upholding it. Because if these organizations are going to mimic the narratives of the State Department, the CIA, guys like John Brennan, then ultimately that's where their interests lie. And there is no amount of quantification or justification around whatever Russia supposedly is or isn't. All of it, in the final analysis, it is ultimately a project of the U.S. military state and the intelligence apparatus, and that anyone who goes along with it is either unaware of that or wholly aware and see it as beneficial to their careers, to their organizations, and to their ultimate interests, and completely antithetical to the interests of a real life. And so I hope that we come away from this book and we come away from this panel and come away from reading things like Black Agenda Report with the commitment to challenging that.
Just very briefly, in terms of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a whole page dedicated to listing what it calls black hate groups. And they're all black nationalist organizations. And the SPLC says straight up that all black nationalists are automatically race hate organizations. And my position would be, if this were a normal society, let the SPLC say whatever they want about black hate groups, and we can say whatever we want about the SPLC. But the SPLC is now used as one of the expert organizations that have been given the task of enforcing censorship in the media. And so we see on Facebook, for example, in terms of black hate speech, on Facebook, more and more folks complain, black Facebook users, that they're being kicked off or suspended just for having regular black conversations about the racial situation, because it hurts the sensibilities, apparently, of the checkers, whether robotic or human, that Facebook employs to monitor these conversations. My position, given the relationship of forces, is that black people should not call for censorship of anybody, because it will always come down
We'll take another question. Let's see, let's go to the gentleman all the way back.
Yeah, my question's about like the iconography and symbolism of empire, and particularly this empire, like personified in the form of Columbia, like a torch-bearing woman with a cloak and gown, moving into like maybe the Uncle Sam character, crotchety old man, and like where are we now? It seems like our symbolism stands out as easily recognizable. But when I think about the symbolism of our empire, the iconography, I think more about the president, the person, less about the larger system at play, and obviously we've got our corporate logos, and then sort of the things that we understand on the economic side. But where are they? How do we point them out in the crowd? How do we keep that target on our radar?
Good question. Does anyone want to take it? Okay, how about Margaret first?
We have to stop using these symbols ourselves, and we have to replace them. 4th of July is this week coming up, and I know people who don't call themselves patriotic. They just go into their cousin's backyard barbecue and want to see fireworks or whatever, but they'll wear red, white, and blue. And, part of me is like, all right, I shouldn't bother somebody because they're wearing red, white, and blue, but part of me says, no, we need to stop that. Yes, you can still go to your cousin's cookout, but wear red, black, and green instead. These symbols are deeply embedded in us, and we don't even realize, like the word Columbia is about Columbus, the District of Columbia, even British Columbia is a province, even pre-Columbian art. We've got to find new ways to talk about this stuff and point it out when we see it, and refuse to use it ourselves whenever we can. But I think replacing is the most important thing, because I don't think you can just take things away from people. I think then you have resentment. People even defend something they don't really want to defend. So it's a heavy lift, but I do believe we have to start.
So on that point too, I would just say that it's everywhere. At this point, it is embedded in the fabric of everything that exists in the United States. And one of the things we talk about in the book is the more seductive examples of the symbolism, one of which the most, if not one of the most highest grossing musicals, Hamilton, is a great example of this. This notion of placing black actors and artists in the garb of Hamilton and the so-called founding fathers as a so-called progressive step forward, to us is really not only really damaging, but a real example of counterinsurgency warfare against the actual radical and leftist traditions of Black America, and that it's all by design, that by being able to commodify and use this kind of symbolism to create a consensus around the redeemability of the United States, we therefore cannot have a project that seeks to completely overturn it. And that's the importance of symbolism, because it's really political education. We're trying to do the opposite kind of political education, but the vast majority of people in the United States, even the most progressive people in the United States, are very vulnerable to this.
Yeah, I mean, as Danny said, this symbolism is everywhere, and it's sometimes very subtle. For example, as soon as I started seeing the advertisements for Chernobyl, I started saying, okay, yeah, that was a terrible event, but why are we hearing about it now? And the U.S. has had its own Chernobyls, by the way, which were much more intentional, like the Bikini Beach nuclear bombings, right, where we were trying out our nuclear bombs on our own soldiers and on people living there. But we know why. We know, and it's a very popular show. I hear about it all the time. There's references to it in other shows, right? And on NPR and whatnot. It's because we're in overdrive trying to vilify Russia. So let's do a whole series on how terrible the Russians are. By the way, the one thing I want to point out, I always like to point out, because even sometimes I forget it, is that we can't forget that Cuba took in 20,000 children from Chernobyl and took care of them for free. And to adulthood, a lot of those kids are now adults and still live there. And yet, you're not going to see an HBO miniseries on that, unless maybe I make it. Maybe that's my next project. But the other thing you see, my kids, for example, love the Marvel comic movies, and those have very, I wouldn't even say subtle forms of jingoism. So you had Black Panther, for example, which was lauded as a victory for African Americans in this country, right? There was one white good guy in it, and what was he? He was a CIA agent. It's not even subtle, right? The CIA is working for black liberation, right? And of course, we can go even deeper to Black Panther. We could have a whole panel on it, right? So, who was the bad guy in it? He was the guy saying they should internationalize the struggle for liberation. And he was called Killmonger. I mean, again, not even subtle, right? And in the end, so what do they do in the end when the good guys, win? the more pacifist people win. They open a community center in Oakland, which of course was one of the birthplaces of the Black Panther movement. So I mean, this is everywhere. The Captain Marvel movie, which again was seen as a victory for feminism. At the end, she allows one of the kids to decide what color her uniform's going to be, and what color it is going to end up being. Red, white, blue, of course, right? But the other thing you see, of course, which is also quite obvious, is how militarized our sporting events have become, right? Every sporting event has to have military people there, carrying the flag, singing. We always have to, of course, sing the national anthem, even before kids' sporting events. Let me just tell you, not every country does this. Not every country sees the gathering of 3 or more people as an occasion to sing their national anthem. And so, yeah, I mean, these are the things that need to be pointed out. You go to a movie theater, you're often, even before the previews, they'll have an advertisement for the U.S. military. Come join us, right? So it is very deep in our culture and our sporting events. And yeah, I mean, it's very troubling. And again, but it needs to be called out for what it is.
So real quickly, I am also a big fan of the Marvel Comics movies, and one of the references we make in the book to them is, first of all, 1,800 films and movies and television shows have been directly intervened upon by the CIA and the Pentagon, and they've had a role in it. But Captain America, we talk about how the shield of Captain America represents this notion that the United States is capable of defending nations around the world, and if people know the story of Captain America, he was fighting the equivalent of the Nazis during the World War II period. And we have a chapter about World War II where we talk about how the United States, the biggest industrialists of the United States, were helping Hitler and the Nazi regime through direct military financing and campaign financing prior to its eventual entrance into the war. So anyway, that's just an aside. Next question, I think.
A woman, please.
Yes, the woman back there. Just raise your hand for a while.
I'm sorry. I gave up. All right, I'm sorry. Thank you. This has been wonderful. I can't wait to read the book. 2 things I want to address. I'll try to be quick. One of them, I saw an interesting podcast Caleb Moulton did with Randy Credico, and he kind of produced the whole Russiagate thing, got to the root of it. He says the Wall Street oil and gas conglomerates want to destroy the gas and oil industry in Russia. It's about price and competition and profits, oil and profits and whatever. And so that demonization and everything has a lot of fuel, if you'll excuse the pun, from the corporations to knock Russia out because we're producing more oil. We want that price to rise. So I'd like to get your feedback on that. And then quickly, on a personal note, the last time I came, I remember Glen said about how the left is very tiny, the real left is very small. And I'm also realizing how easily demonized you are if you're not one of the normals. Then you're like one of the extremists. And my family gave me a ticket to Hamilton for my birthday, and they were thrilled for me. But I had read articles on Hamilton and Isaac Reed stuff and your stuff, and so I went, and I was just appalled by it. It's like, oh my God, doesn't anybody see this? Ignoring slavery and the genocide of the American Indian, and I wonder if I hadn't had that consciousness raising from articles about it, would I have just gone in and oh, isn't this a treat and everything, instead of having that sane reaction to it, and I remember reading an article on Miranda who said it was a buzzkill to talk about slavery. He had a song about slavery, and it ruined the momentum of the musical, and it's like, oh my God. And I, just a couple, when I worked for Jill Stein and Trump won, people in my office, the Hillary feminists, stopped talking to me for 3 months. And one woman screamed at me when I called her a war criminal finally. We had a discussion about it, and she jumped up like a 2-year-old with her hands over, and then she said, "You're getting your information wrong, you're getting your information wrong." And it was, you know, and she's supposed to be the most political and enlightened one in the office and stuff. And then just finally, I tweet a lot, and I work third shift, so I tweet at night, and there were this group of Hillbot tweeters who discovered I was tweeting at night and assumed, with their excellent detective work, I was a Russian bot. I lived in Russia because of the time of day. And that, you know, that witch hunting, I mean, it was comical, but it was also like, shit, like, you know, because they had found how easily they jumped to that conclusion. It was kind of creepy.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. So there's one question in there, real briefly. The gentleman right here has a question. I'll just address it real quickly. I think the entire U.S. effort to destabilize Russia is all about economic competition. It's about Russia's economy actually growing. People say, some leftists like to say it's an imperialist country, but its capitalist infrastructure is way too weak at the moment. But it is ascendant. It is developing. And it's doing so based on deep relationships with China, and doing so in a way that ultimately destabilizes the monopoly capitalists in the U.S. and European world. So that is really what Russiagate's about, and that's what the broader war, which is, you know, way before Russiagate, really dates back to the Obama period, when the Obama administration made it a mission to militarily encircle Russia along its European borders. Does anyone want to take a question? We'll take the gentleman.
Very good, smart thing. When we refer that mixing of the government and the people of the country, like when we refer the US thinks so, India thinks so, that makes lots of things in the mind, subconscious mind of people to legitimize the action of that particular country. Like US intervention in Iran in terms of war, taking them. The word used repeatedly on TV news and people who write that this is what the US is doing, as if that US president has the mandate of the US. And that subconscious mind creates lots of problem in terms of mixing people of that country and the ruling party or the government or the president of the country in terms of protesting.
Thanks for the comment. You had a question here for a long time. For a question? Do you have a question?
Yes. One phrase that confuses stood out is about these ideologies that are baked in. There's also a lot of silence that's baked into the American the media and culture. And there is the unspoken assumption that America, well, may not be a perfect democracy or a perfectly free society, but it's at least almost a very degree, and that's assumed. And then you have silence about the report of Greg Pallas and the suppression of the vote in 2016. There was a book about 20 years ago called Race Against Empire, really classic work. And it talked about how over a 6-month period in 1947, as the Marshall Plan was rolled out, the black press all across America, in terms of black internationalism, which you talked about, just went silent. That perspective disappeared. There are whole movements today that are either follow a peculiar path, like the problems of 9/11, and you go with this group and embrace what they call simultaneous detonation theory or some nonsense. You have to, if you have an objection, formulate it this way, where there's no movement on Puerto Rico, which I would think in a free society there would be, at least in huge states with huge populations of religion. And this goes on and on. Mostly submerged the questions of the dynamics and the mechanisms of that. There seems to be addressed at society.
Thank you for the comment. Does our panel have anything they want to say before? We have about a minute left. We close Alice was great and wonderful.